The neighborhood had always prided itself on uniformity. Each lawn trimmed with military precision, each home painted in muted tones, approved years ago by the Homeowners Association, and every holiday decoration measured against the invisible but ever-present standards of what the board deemed acceptable. It was a neighborhood where conformity was king, and any deviation, no matter how minor, was swiftly stamped out. I moved into this place full of excitement. It was a kind of neighborhood that, on the surface, promised peace and community spirit. The houses lined the streets like storybook cutouts, complete with picket fences and manicured shrubs. For the first few months, I kept to myself, settling in, learning the rhythm of the place, and keeping my head down. But as December rolled around, my excitement shifted towards something I had been planning all year: my Christmas lights. Decorating for Christmas wasn't just a tradition in my family. It was an art form. My father had spent years building elaborate displays, and I carried on the tradition. When the first chill of winter hit, I unpacked boxes filled with carefully coiled strings of lights, mechanical figures, and even a custom-built sleigh that my father had passed down to me. To me, these weren't just decorations. They were memories, a way to honor the people and moments that had shaped me. That first weekend of December, I set everything up. The process was exhausting, but exhilarating. The roof line sparkled with perfectly aligned lights, glowing icicles hung from the eaves, and the lawn transformed into a winter wonderland complete with reindeer, candy canes, and a glowing nativity scene. At the center stood the sleigh, lit in a warm golden glow, with Santa waving cheerfully at anyone who passed. When I finally plugged it all in, the neighborhood lit up in a cascade of color. Cars slowed down as they drove past. Children pressed their faces against car windows. Some even hopped out to snap pictures in front of the display. For a few nights, it felt magical. The neighborhood, usually so stiff and orderly, seemed to loosen its grip just a little, if only to enjoy the spirit of the season. But, of course, not everyone was pleased. On the morning of the fifth day after setting up, I found the envelope taped to my door. It was stark white, with the HOA's emblem in the corner, like a stamp of authority. Inside, the letter was short but sharp. Your holiday decorations have been deemed excessive and disruptive to the peace of the community. The brightness of your display is in violation of HOA guidelines. You are hereby instructed to reduce or remove the lights immediately. I remember standing there on my porch, letter in hand, feeling my chest tighten. My display wasn't loud. It didn't blare music into night or block anyone's driveway. It was lights. Simple, beautiful, festive lights. And yet, here I was being told they were too much. I thought about compliance. I thought about dimming the display or removing a few elements, just enough to appease them. After all, that was the easy path, the path most people in this neighborhood seemed to take. They lived in fear of the HOA, bending at the slightest pressure to avoid confrontation. But then I looked out at my yard, at the children who came by every evening with wide eyes, their parents snapping pictures as if it were a local attraction, at the way my lights made the long, dark winter nights feel just a little brighter. And I thought about my father, the years he spent perfecting his displays, the pride he took in bringing joy to his neighbors. No, I wasn't to take it down. Not now. Not ever. The next night, I flipped the switch as usual, and my house came alive in glowing brilliance. Neighbors cheered. Cars lined up along the curb. The air buzzed with holiday spirit. But behind the cheer, I could feel the tension brewing. The HOA wasn't done with me, not by a long shot. And sure enough, within days, they escalated. Another letter, this one harsher. They cited specific bylaws, claiming my lights exceeded the maximum brightness allowed. They mentioned fines, threats of legal action, and even the possibility of placing a lien on my property if I continued to defy them. It was clear they wanted me to bow down, to bend like everyone else. But they didn't know me. As I read that second letter under the glow of my Christmas lights, something inside me hardened. They thought they could bully me, push me into submission with threats and legal jargon. But they were about to learn that I wasn't the type to back down. If they thought my lights were too bright now, they hadn't seen anything yet, because I had a plan. And when I was finished, the HOA would regret ever sending that first letter. The first letter from the HOA had been a nuisance, a warning I could brush aside with little thought. But the second one carried a different tone. It was longer, filled with official language, citations of bylaws, and veiled threats of consequences should I continue to violate the peace and harmony of the community. It wasn't just about brightness anymore. They now claimed my lights were creating traffic congestion as cars slowed down or stopped to admire the display. They accused me of creating a safety hazard, of disturbing the balance of the neighborhood. Reading those words, I could almost hear the self-righteous tone of whoever had drafted it. The HOA was no longer simply annoyed. They were preparing for war. And at the center of it all was one name that appeared again and again in the correspondence: Margaret. Margaret was the president of the HOA, though most neighbors had another name for her: the Queen of Rules. She was the type of person who treated bylaws like scripture, wielding them as weapons against anyone who dared step out of line. For years, she had dictated the smallest details of neighborhood life. Paint colors, mailbox designs, even the acceptable height of holiday wreaths. It was her way or no way. And now, she had turned her sights on me. The letters didn't come alone. Each day, I noticed small shifts in the way some neighbors interacted with me. A few avoided eye contact, their smiles forced and fleeting. Others offered quiet encouragement, whispering their admiration for my stubbornness when Margaret wasn't around. A line was being drawn in the neighborhood, and people were choosing sides. My lights had become more than decoration. They were a symbol of resistance or defiance, depending on who you asked. One evening, just after turning on the display, I caught movement at the edge of my yard. Two figures stood in the shadows, clipboard in hand, jotting notes and pointing flashlights toward my roofline. They lingered for nearly half an hour, measuring, photographing, documenting every angle of my setup. I didn't need to ask who they were. Margaret had sent her enforcers, determined to gather evidence to use against me. I watched them from behind my curtains, anger simmering just beneath the surface. It wasn't enough for them to send letters. They wanted to intimidate me, to remind me that the HOA was always watching. But instead of fear, I felt resolve harden within me. If they thought this would make me back down, they were sorely mistaken. Days turned into a week, and the HOA's campaign intensified. Another letter arrived, this one outlining daily fines of $100 should I continue operating my display. The total, they warned, would accrue until I complied. They claimed the fines could be attached as a lien against my property, a threat designed to strike fear into any homeowner. For most people, it would have been enough to cave. The idea of mounting fines and the possibility of losing one's home was a heavy burden to carry. But I wasn't most people. Instead of retreating, I began documenting everything. Each letter was carefully filed, each late-night inspection noted with time and date. I took photos of the display, showing how neatly it was set up, how nothing blocked sidewalks or spilled into the street. I gathered testimonies from neighbors who loved the lights, families who came nightly to enjoy them. Slowly, a case was building, not against me, but against the HOA. And in the background, another plan was forming. Something bigger, something bolder. If Margaret thought she had seen the full extent of my Christmas spirit, she was about to be proven wrong. The turning point came when I overheard a conversation outside one evening. A group of neighbors, gathered near the sidewalk, debated the situation. One man argued that I was in the wrong, that rules were rules, and I should respect the HOA. But another woman fired back, pointing out that the rules Margaret cited were vague, outdated, and selectively enforced. Why, she asked, were my lights a violation when other homes had equally bright decorations without consequence? Why was I being singled out? Their words fueled me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about fairness, about standing up to a system that thrived on fear and control. The HOA had picked the wrong person to target. Margaret didn't know it yet, but with each letter she sent, with each fine she threatened, she was pushing me closer to an idea that would shift the balance entirely. I wasn't just going to defend my display, I was going to make it untouchable. The next morning, I made a few phone calls. To local businesses, to charities, to contacts I had in town who loved the holidays as much as I did. If Margaret wanted to frame my lights as a nuisance, I would turn them into something undeniable, something so publicly supported that the HOA wouldn't dare move against it. But that was still in the works. For now, I kept my head high, my lights on, and my resolve steady. The HOA wanted to fight, and they were about to get one. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't preparing to play defense anymore. I was preparing to go nuclear. By the time the third week of December rolled around, the situation had grown into something much larger than a dispute over holiday lights. What had begun as a festive display had become the centerpiece of a neighborhood war. The HOA was relentless, sending letters almost daily now, each one more threatening than the last. The fines they claimed I owed had reached thousands of dollars on paper, each new day adding another 100 to the total. Margaret wanted me crushed, broken under the weight of their authority. But instead of breaking me, their attacks only fueled my determination. Each time a letter arrived, I slid it into the growing stack on my desk, a physical record of their obsession. The folder thickened, evidence of harassment masquerading as enforcement. I had already consulted with a friend who worked in law, and their words echoed in my mind. They're bluffing. They can't actually enforce most of this without due process. That was all I needed to hear. The fear they expected never came. In its place, something else grew, spite. If they hated my display as it was, then I would give them more to hate. The first edition was small, almost petty. A 20-foot inflatable snowman appeared on my lawn overnight, towering over the reindeer and candy canes. Its grin seemed to mock the HOA itself, a silent reminder that I wasn't backing down. The next night, I added synchronized spotlights, casting shimmering patterns of red and green against the house. Soon, the display wasn't just lights and inflatables. It was a show. Neighbors noticed immediately. Some cheered me on, dropping off cookies and hot chocolate as they gathered to watch. Others scowled from behind their curtains, whispering their disapproval to anyone who would listen. The divide widened with each passing day. What Margaret had hoped would be a simple case of enforcement had spiraled into a neighborhood spectacle. And then came the night I pushed it further still. I had been tinkering with the old controllers my father left me, the kind that allowed lights to dance in rhythm with music. It had taken hours of rewiring and testing, but when I finally connected it all, the result was breathtaking. At the flip of a switch, my home became a living, breathing symphony of light and sound. Strings of bulbs pulsed in time to carols. The sleigh lit up with each note, and the reindeer seemed to leap in rhythm. Cars lined up along the curb, families piling out to watch the show. Children squealed in delight, clapping along with the music. Word spread quickly, and soon, what had been a quiet street transformed into an attraction. Videos of the display began popping up on social media, gathering likes, shares, and comments from people across town. My house was no longer just a decoration. It was an event. But for every cheer that echoed through the night, there was an equal measure of fury brewing in Margaret's world. One evening, as the show wrapped up, I noticed movement near the edge of the property. A pair of HOA members, flashlights in hand, were snapping photos again, muttering to each other as they pointed at different sections of the display. This time, I didn't stay hidden. I stepped outside, standing tall beneath the glow of the lights. The look on their faces said it all. They weren't expecting me to confront them, but they also knew they had no real power in that moment. Without a word, they retreated, their clipboards clutched tightly to their chests as if they were shields. It was clear that Margaret and her board were rattled. Their letters had done nothing. Their fines meant nothing. And now, instead of isolating me, they had inadvertently given me an audience, a community of supporters who gathered nightly to celebrate what the HOA condemned. Of course, not every neighbor was happy. A handful began lodging complaints directly, grumbling about the traffic, the noise, the circus-like atmosphere on what had once been a quiet street. They accused me of disrupting their peace, of turning the neighborhood into a sideshow. These were Margaret's allies, the ones who had always clung to the illusion of order and control. To them, I wasn't just a nuisance. I was a threat to their way of life. But their voices were drowned out by the cheers, the laughter, the joy radiating from the crowd each night. For every complaint, there were 10 praises. For every glare from a window, there were 20 smiles from children waving sparklers on the sidewalk. It was in those moments that I realized something important. This was no longer about me versus the HOA. It was about joy versus control, tradition versus tyranny. Margaret wanted darkness, uniformity, silence. I wanted light, color, and celebration. The more they tried to stamp me out, the brighter I wanted to shine. The local news caught wind of it next. A reporter showed up one evening, camera crew in tow, filming the spectacle and interviewing families who had come see it. The story aired the next day, painting my house as a beacon of holiday spirit under attack by a joyless HOA. Comments pouring online, strangers offering their support, calling Margaret and her board Grinches and Scrooges. My inbox filled with messages from people I had never met, encouraging me to keep going. Margaret's iron grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and she knew it. Her next move was desperate. Another letter arrived, this one not just threatening fines, but warning of legal proceedings. They claimed my display violated not only HOA bylaws, but city ordinances, though no citations were provided. It was clear they were grasping at straws, hoping fear the law would succeed where their fines had failed. But I wasn't afraid, because by then, the idea of my nuclear option had taken full shape. My plans were bigger than ever before, involving not just lights and music, but something the HOA couldn't possibly fight against without looking like villains to the entire community. For now, though, I smiled each night as the lights came on brighter, louder, and prouder than ever. The HOA had wanted submission. Instead, I gave them escalation. And I wasn't done yet. The real battle hadn't even started. By mid-December, the neighborhood felt less like a quiet suburb and more like the stage for a battle everyone had been waiting to see. On one side stood Margaret and her board, clutching their bylaws like holy scripture, convinced that order and silence were the only acceptable states of existence. On the other side stood me, backed by families, children, and strangers who came from across town to see the lights that the HOA condemned. But beneath the spectacle, I was working on something bigger. Something that would transform my home from a simple display into a cause, a rallying point so powerful that the HOA wouldn't dare challenge it. If they thought my synchronized light show was my final move, they were wrong. I had been quietly planning the nuclear option. It started with a few phone calls. I reached out to a local food bank, one that always struggled to meet demand during the holidays. I explained what was happening, the lights, the crowds, the growing media attention, and suggested a partnership. People were already flocking to see the display. Why not turn that traffic into something meaningful? The food bank agreed instantly. They would provide donation bins, volunteers, and even signage to let visitors know their contributions would go directly to families in need. Next, I called a children's hospital downtown. Their annual toy drive had been slow this year, and they were desperate for help. When I offered to host a drop-off point, tying it to the now-famous light display, they jumped at the chance. The idea of Christmas lights powering a toy drive gave them something tangible to promote, something that tied joy to giving. By the end of that week, my yard wasn't just a light show. It was a community hub. Donation bins lined the driveway, wrapped like giant presents. Signs explained how visitors could bring food and toys, turning the holiday attraction into a force for good. Volunteers from the food bank and the hospital stood at the curb with warm smiles, collecting bags and thanking families who gave. The effect was immediate. Where once there had been only gawking and cheering, now there was giving. Cars pulled up not just to watch, but to deliver boxes of canned goods, bags of toys, envelopes of donations. Families lingered longer, proud to be part of something bigger than themselves. And every night, as the lights danced in time to music, the bins filled higher, overflowing with generosity. The media couldn't resist. A second news crew arrived, this time not to cover the Christmas lights feud, but to highlight the charitable efforts behind it. The story painted me not as a stubborn homeowner resisting the HOA, but as a community leader turning conflict into compassion. The headline was clear: Neighborhood Christmas lights fueled charity drive despite HOA pushback. It spread fast. Social media lit up with photos of the donations, videos of children placing toys under glowing candy canes, stories of families who came from miles away just to be part of it. The narrative shifted completely. This wasn't about brightness anymore. It was about giving. And who would dare stand against that? Margaret, of course. When she realized what I had done, she was furious. The next HOA letter arrived with even more venom, accusing me of turning the neighborhood into a commercial zone by partnering with outside organizations. She claimed I was exploiting the holidays for personal gain, though I hadn't kept a single cent. The letter threatened escalation to city officials, demanding immediate removal of unauthorized signage and donation bins. But it was too late. The nuclear option had worked exactly as I intended. By tying the lights to charity, I had wrapped myself in a shield of public goodwill. To attack me now was to attack hungry families, sick children, and the spirit of giving itself. The backlash against Margaret was swift. Neighbors who had previously remained silent began to speak up, They gathered at board meetings, demanding to know why the HOA was targeting something that brought joy and generosity. One resident pointed out that the bylaws Margaret clung to were written decades ago, with no mention of holiday displays of this scale. Another questioned why the board spent so much energy on lights while ignoring real issues like broken streetlights and neglected landscaping. Margaret tried to argue, to insist that rules were rules, but her words fell flat. Each time she spoke against me, someone countered with stories of the good the display was doing. A family that received food from the donations stood up and thanked me publicly. A nurse from the hospital spoke about how the toy drive had doubled its usual haul thanks to the attention my lights brought. For once, Margaret didn't have the crowd on her side. Meanwhile, the donations grew. By the final week before Christmas, my yard looked less like a single home and more like a festival. Bins overflowed nightly, volunteers bustled with cheer, and the synchronized show ran like clockwork, dazzling visitors who stayed for hours. Local businesses even pitched in, donating hot chocolate, cookies, and blankets for those who came to watch. Every night felt like a victory, not just over Margaret, but over the small-mindedness she represented. Where she saw disruption, I saw connection. Where she saw rules, I saw joy. And every flash of light, every carol that played, every can of food dropped into a bin reminded me that the fight had become something bigger than I had ever imagined. But the HOA wasn't finished. Margaret was too prideful, too stubborn to let go. Behind closed doors, she and her board scrambled to find a way to regain control. Rumors spread of emergency meetings, of lawyers consulted, of new strategies to silence me. They were preparing one final push, one last desperate attempt to crush me before Christmas Day. And I was ready for them. Because what Margaret hadn't realized was that by escalating this far, by dragging it into the public eye, she had lost the one thing the HOA needed most: the support of the neighborhood. The cracks were already showing. And soon, the entire structure she had built her authority on would come crashing down. The week before Christmas arrived with a tension that clung to the neighborhood like frost on the rooftops. For weeks, the lights had glowed brighter, the donations had piled higher, and the crowds had swelled larger. What began as a dispute over two bright decorations had become a spectacle the whole city seemed to know about. Each night, carloads of families came to marvel, donate, and take photos under the glittering archway of lights. Each morning, local news stations reported on the incredible generosity pouring from my driveway. But behind the glow and cheer, the HOA was unraveling. Margaret, once the iron-fisted president of the board, found herself drowning in a tide she could no longer control. The louder she protested, the more out of touch she appeared. Every angry letter she sent only fueled public sympathy for me. Every attempt to tighten her grip only made her look like the villain in a story where the ending had already been written. It all came to a head at the December HOA meeting. The community hall was packed beyond capacity. Folding chairs lined the walls. Residents spilled into the hallway, and cameras from two local news stations set up in the back. Margaret sat the front, flanked by the remaining board members. But even from where I stood, I could see the strain etched on her face. Her usual posture, rigid, commanding, immovable, looked frayed. The meeting began with formality, but the atmosphere quickly shifted. One by one, residents stood up to speak. First was a young mother who lived 3 houses down. Her voice trembled as she thanked me for turning the holiday season into something magical for her children. She described how her family had struggled financially that year and how the food donations had carried them through. She looked Margaret in the eye as she asked why anyone would want to take that away. Next came an elderly couple, longtime homeowners who had rarely attended meetings before. They spoke of how they'd never seen the neighborhood so alive, so full of laughter and community spirit. For years, they said, the HOA had made the neighborhood feel cold and lifeless. But now, thanks to the lights, it felt like home again. The testimonies kept coming. Families who donated, volunteers who collected toys, even a small business owner who credited the increased foot traffic for saving his shop during a difficult season. Each story was another nail in the coffin of Margaret's authority. By the time it was my turn to speak, the room was already buzzing with discontent. I didn't need to deliver a fiery speech. All I had to do was point to the bins overflowing with food and toys, the smiles on children's faces, the headlines praising our little neighborhood. I reminded them that this wasn't about one house or one man. It was about community. about how the season of giving had finally returned to our street. Despite the HOA's efforts to smother it, the applause was immediate and thunderous. Margaret banged her gavel, red-faced, demanding order. But the crowd wasn't listening to her anymore. For years, she had ruled through intimidation, threatening fines, enforcing petty rules, wielding the bylaws like a weapon. But that night, the spell broke. The room that had once cowered in silence rose against her. Residents demanded answers. Why were HOA funds being spent on lawyer consultations to attack holiday decorations? Why were letters filled with threats when real neighborhood problems were ignored? Why had Margaret declared war on joy itself? Margaret tried to respond, but her words fell flat. Her allies on the board shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. One even stood and admitted he no longer supported her stance. He confessed that he'd been pressured into compliance, but now, with the community united, he refused to play along. The tension snapped. A motion was made to the floor, rare, but allowed under the bylaws. The motion called for Margaret's removal as HOA president. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by cheers. A vote was demanded, and the board, cornered, had no choice but to allow it. What followed was nothing short of poetic. Hands shot up across the room, one after another, in overwhelming support of removing her. Even those who had once been silent raised their hands high, their patience finally exhausted. When the count was finished, the result was undeniable. Margaret was out, the woman who had ruled with fear and rigidity, who had tried to crush joy under the weight of her rules, was dethroned in front of everyone she once controlled. She left the hall in a storm of muttered threats, her once commanding presence reduced to a shadow. For the first time in years, the neighborhood exhaled. The reign of Margaret was over. In the days that followed, the atmosphere shifted entirely. With Margaret gone, the new interim board chose not to pursue any further action against me. The fines, the threats, the letters, all of it vanished like smoke. Instead, they embraced the spirit of the season, even volunteering at the donation bins themselves. The lights grew brighter than ever in that final week before Christmas. Crowds grew so large that the police had to direct traffic, not to shut it down, but to keep it flowing safely. What had begun as an act of defiance had become a citywide tradition in the span of a month. And in the middle of it all, I stood on my lawn, watching the glow of the display reflect in the faces of children holding toys, parents clasping warm drinks, neighbors greeting each other like old friends. For once, it felt like the neighborhood wasn't just a collection of houses, but a true community. Margaret had tried to crush me. She had thrown everything she had into stopping me. But in the end, it was her obsession, her refusal to bend, that broke her. Christmas Eve was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The bins overflowed for the last time. Volunteers cheered as they loaded trucks with donations, and the synchronized show ended with finale so bright and breathtaking that the entire street erupted in applause. The nuclear option had worked. Not only had I defended my lights, but I had transformed the neighborhood forever. Yet even as I celebrated, I knew one thing. People like Margaret never disappear quietly. She might have lost her crown, but she wasn't finished with me. Not yet. The final chapter of the story was still waiting to be written. Christmas Eve arrived like a drum roll, building anticipation with every hour that passed. For weeks, the lights had burned brighter than ever. The donations had piled higher, and the neighborhood had grown closer. Margaret was gone, stripped of her title, and humiliated in front of the very people she once commanded. But the last few months had taught me anything. It was that people like Margaret rarely surrendered without one final act of defiance. And sure enough, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the first strand of lights flickered to life. I felt it, a tension in the air, thick as ice before a storm. Crowds gathered early that night, more than ever before. Cars lined the streets for blocks. Families spilled out with bags of toys and food, and volunteers hustled to keep up with the constant flow of donations. News vans parked nearby, cameras ready to capture the biggest night yet. The finale had drawn them in like moths to a flame. The show began right at 7 o'clock. Music filled the air, synchronized with a dazzling choreography of lights. Arches of color rippled in waves. Candy canes twinkled in time, and a massive tree at the center pulsed like a beating heart. Children shrieked with delight. Parents clapped along, and the crowd moved as one with every swell of music. It should have been perfect. But halfway through performance, headlights cut through the dark. A black SUV rolled up slowly, stopping right in front of my house. The crowd shifted, murmurs spreading as Margaret herself emerged. She wasn't dressed for the occasion. No festive red or green, no winter cheer. She wore a long, dark coat, her expression cold and sharp, as though she had come not to celebrate, but to reclaim something she believed was hers. She didn't speak. Not at first. She simply stood there, arms folded, glaring at the lights as though sheer willpower could snuff them out. Then, as the finale built towards crescendo, she stepped forward. The music faltered. For a split second, the speakers cut out, the synchronized rhythm broken. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Margaret shouted something inaudible, her voice shrill and ragged. The volunteers rushed to steady the sound system, reconnecting wires, bringing the music back. But the damage was done. She had inserted herself into the moment, demanding attention. And then came her mistake. Margaret pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket and raised it above her head. She screamed that this spectacle, this circus, this chaos was illegal. She waved the paper like a weapon, claiming it was proof from city officials that the display had to end immediately. The crowd froze, uncertainty spreading. Cameras zoomed in. For a moment, it felt like she might seize back control. But she underestimated the tide she was standing against. A city representative, who had quietly attended that night to witness the impact of the charity drive, stepped forward. He took the paper from Margaret, scanned it, and shook his head. Into the waiting microphones, he explained that it was nothing more than a cease and desist letter Margaret had drafted herself. Completely invalid, completely unenforceable. The gas from the crowd turned to laughter, then to jeers. Margaret's face twisted in fury as the representative continued, praising the donations, the joy, and the unprecedented sense of community the lights had brought. He announced that the city supported the display fully, not just this year, but in years to come. It was a final blow. Margaret screamed, her voice breaking as she tried to fight back, but her words were drowned out by the applause. Neighbors turned their backs on her, refusing to give her the attention she craved. Families cheered louder. Children sang along with the restarted music, and the lights surged brighter than ever, as though mocking her. Defeated, she stormed back to her SUV and drove off into the night. Tires screeching, her reign over the neighborhood truly ended. The finale resumed, more powerful than ever. The lights cascaded in a shimmering wave. The tree burst into golden brilliance, and the music swelled to its triumphant peak. Fireworks erupted overhead, unplanned but perfectly timed, donated by a local business owner who wanted to honor the moment. The crowd roared in delight, their cheers carrying down every street. As the final song ended, the donations were tallied. Mountains of food, hundreds of toys, and thousands of dollars have been raised, all sparked by the very conflict Margaret had tried to extinguish. Families in need would be fed, children in hospitals would smile on Christmas morning, and the neighborhood had found its heart again. I stood at the edge of my lawn, watching it all unfold, the glow of the lights reflecting in the faces of those around me. Strangers hugged, neighbors shook hands, and children danced in the snow. It was more than I had ever hoped for when I first strung up those two bright lights. The war with the HOA was over. The season had been saved. And Margaret, the woman who had tried to control everything, had lost not just her title, but her place in the community. For years, she would be remembered not as the enforcer of rules, but as the Grinch who failed to steal Christmas. And me? I had gone nuclear. And in doing so, I had lit up not just my house, but the entire neighborhood. The story of the lights, the donations, and the showdown would spread far beyond our little street. But for me, the true victory was simpler. Knowing that for one perfect Christmas night, joy had triumphed over pettiness, generosity had defeated control, and light had conquered the dark. The lights clicked off at midnight. The crowd slowly dispersed, and silence finally returned to the street. But the glow lingered in every heart that had been there, and that was a brightness no HOA rule could ever dim.